Hello, I'm Shanae Javeri, Assistant Curator of International Modern and Contemporary Art. And today we are at Carol Beauvais studio in Red Hook, Brooklyn. Carol, we're 1 week away from installing your sculptures on the facade of the Met. I know it's an incredibly busy time. Maybe we can begin by talking a little bit about the space, the studio itself. When did you move in to this particular unit? What attracted you to it? What brought you here? Was it just an organic kind of extension of how your practice was evolving?
I moved here in 2016, and it was, I was looking for a temporary place to stage the show I was doing with David Zwirner. And because I really like to work in real scale, then I need big practice spaces, and that was the intention. But then one thing led to another, and then I took it as a permanent space. And the good things about it, it gave me more height here than I had previously at my other studio. And I have these roll gates here. It came with an overhead crane, and so just right out of the gate, it took friction out of the process.
So it really matched the way you worked and wanted to work, which is no preparatory sketches or drawings. It's spontaneous and improvised at scale and in the round.
Right.
And you do all the fabrication in-house, correct?
Yeah, the vast majority.
Maybe we can walk through the actual stages, a kind of précis version of how the sculptures come to be.
Yeah.
So there's the kind of composition stage, then the production engineering, and then the actual engineering part of it. So
that's true, but I think what has been really, since I have an in-house process, and I don't send work out to be fabricated, I can interfere with and adjust as things are being engineered, which is actually a really amazing, unique luxury, I think, so that something can be, I have the idea, I'm like floating something in the air, then I can pull over the production engineer, and then we can start creating a connection, and then we can bring over the engineer, and then they can make comments on it, and then that communication is really fluid, back and forth, means that there's not like a engineering solution to begin with, and there's not an engineering solution to end with. It's sort of like in the process.
You've been working mostly or primarily with stainless steel, and you had a earlier group of sculptures which you call collage sculptures, where you had some scrap metal which was then brought together with the stainless steel industrial tubes that you massage, twist, contort on site over here with the hydraulic press. And then those elements, as you were saying, are lifted into the air with the gantry, and then they kind of dance around for you.
Right.
And then do you weld them and assemble them in the air? Or again, is it, as you're saying, this process of just being able to feel how the materials, the particular pieces interact with one another?
We typically tack them together in the air, and then we'll bring them down to do something more substantial. Or sometimes just we'll kind of build a scaffold around them and then do the engineering there.
And then following the engineering, there's the kind of second arm of the kind of fabrication, which is the body working and the kind of paint technique. And maybe you can tell us a little bit how you've arrived at, this incredible facility that the studio and yourself have managed, which is it's almost alchemical, how the materials don't feel like themselves. They get pushed to their extreme in that sense.
Yeah, and it's really been just a little bit at a time, because the first experiments that I did with crushing the steel were very modest. We had a small shop press, and we got some, 4x3 steel tubes, and just like, smashed it. And it kind of came out of this, I think everybody in the studio was feeling like depressed for some reason. And so then I was like, let's just crush things. Hey, how do you think we could really crush something? You know? And so then everybody said, I know, let's drop something heavy. And there was just like this brainstorm of like how we do it. And it just like came out of that. And it does really chase the blues away, I have to say.
It's a sense of real release.
Yeah, no, it's really good. And crushing steel and also lifting it, heavy things gives you, it's enlightening. It feels really good.
It's remarkable that it can be so effortless with materials which have such a heft and a weight to them. I mean, these are not easy things to kind of move, but there's such a kind of incredible ease with how you'll kind of engage them. And now it's been how many years since you've been making these sculptures?
Maybe 5 or 6. Yeah. Yeah, but I think it's like, it looks like what it is. So in a way it has to be easy. Yeah. And the part that's not easy is sanding them, because there's a lot. And it's very tricky to paint them. I mean, you know, of course there's skill that goes all the way, but in getting them off the ground, it has to be easy, because you feel it, and you feel the sense of ease. And so then there's been an investment in more and more, you know, things that can get something off the ground. And you know, the latest is the crane, the mini crane. And that really gives us precision and just a lot of capacity.
And could we maybe talk a little bit about, and I know this is something that you're quite particular about and it also excites you, is the actual coming together of the materials, the joining, the welding, and the kind of, you know, there's a certification from each of the welds, and that whole process of the sculptors do this incredible thing where the hand seems invisible, but you also see the points of connection. They're made manifest for you.
And in making them, I do want to show the artifact of how it's made. And so you see, like, very crudely, there are heavy welds and there are, you know, connection points. But then when it goes into finishing, all of those rough connection points are left, but then all the surface blemishes that maybe are distracting are removed. And then it's prepared for the painter in such a way that the paint leaves no trace. So it just seems like color. So you see the artifact of it's being made, but you don't see the artifact of it's being painted. And then that is actually a really confusing, perceptually confusing way that it presents, you know?
I mean, that's what the sculptures do when they're finished. They throw the viewer slightly off balance because you're trying to kind of really grasp what you're seeing. And your eye feels like it's touching the material, because the materials have this incredible tactile quality to them. After this, you know, the sandblasting and then the paint with the matte finish, there's a softness, a suppleness to them, an organic quality to them. And I think that's, as you've spoken about it, it creates this illusion that throws people off balance. It decenters themselves, and then they have to bring themselves back and be like, oh, so their entire consciousness kind of opens up to being aware, and it takes them out of their own body.
I hope so. I mean, that's my experience of them. And it's partly that you have because the act of looking is brought to consciousness, then you are brought into the present moment in a way, because you're like, I'm looking at this thing, wait, I don't get it. And so then that sort of like, I don't get it, kind of wakes you up to this idea of looking. So this is a hydraulic shop press, and this is the tool that we use for the smaller tubes, for the 6-inch by 6-inch tubes. And we've you know, made some modifications to it. We've added this bed that collapses, so that when this piston presses down, then there's a place for the bend to go, so it doesn't get crushed. You know, if we didn't have this, then it makes the bottom of the piece really flat. And then we've fabricated a bunch of these dies. This one is one that we use a lot to make something just look organically kind of crunched up, to crush it on the corners. But if we're going to fold it, like all of the Met pieces have some 90-degree angles. And there's a special formula for that where, we use a series of dies to sort of press it and then to punch it, and then we fold it closed using a chain hoist. But here's a bunch of our different dies that we use. So here's when you see that's like a triangle, and that's one that we would use to make a angle, like a corner.
Okay.
And then we built, after, we used this for a while, and then we thought, well, if we want to use a bigger type of tube, then we need a bigger version. So then we built one that's over here.
And so the dies, you've kind of evolved them as you've gone along.
Yeah.
They're not like ready-made that you pick off the shelf. They've
No. Yeah.
They've each been kind of custom and bespoke to the effect that you would want to be kind of achieve on the...
Yeah, and it's like, right, the first time we did it, we just like pressed, we put a tube in there, and we pressed this down, we're like, oh, and then you say like, okay, well you get the negative impression of that.
Yeah.
Like, okay, that's not very interesting. So we're like, so we should make the negative shape, or we make the positive of what we want to see the negative of. So then we started to build these different dies.
And so this is the first part of the process.
Mm-hmm.
They get kind of into their form, and that's after they're in their forms, they get gantryed up, and then they start to kind of dance with each other.
Well, yeah, first they would get massaged, and then sometimes actually they go then into on this scale, they go into the bigger press vertically, and that gives them a really interesting...
That kind of like compressed, like they're melting onto each other.
Yeah,
so.
They can look very like juicy that way. But then you can see we built a cage around it, because sometimes they just fly out when we're doing that. So there's like...
We want to protect everybody.
Yeah, but since we're always making up new things, then we have safety procedures that are sort of like, when you're innovating, what's the process for innovating that's safe? It's always like, has to have 3 people. It's like one person comes up with it, they check it with somebody else, they work on it some more, and then they like bring one person in to say like, what could possibly go wrong here? The most dangerous things we use is just like, what do we call it? It's like potential energy, like something will be like under a lot of pressure. And this is the 12 by 12 inch tube that we used for the Met. It got sandblasted, and then it's been body worked. So it has Bondo in the, some of the tool marks that I didn't think were nice to look at. This is how we typically do it if we paint them. This is getting painted. But with the work for the Met, then we did all the body work in steel. So we filled the imperfections with molten steel.
Okay.
and then sanded that. So it's all worked. Instead of being worked in Bondo, it's worked in steel.
And each part of it is done individually. So they work the entire surface.
Yeah, they work the entire surface, yeah. Because stainless steel is actually like very hard. And like, steel is too, but stainless is hard in a different way. And it's actually very brittle. And so to get it to have these supple, fatty looking folds is sort of a trick, but with mild steel, it wants to do that. And it's just softer. It's very like
it gives itself
ductile.
over more easily. Here, there's a little bit more resistance.
And like collapse. I mean, it's harder and stronger in some ways, but it's less structural because it yields
then when applied, when the pressure is applied.
Yeah.
It yields in a different way than something that's too giving as a material.
Right. This was a test, a paint test. The painter was practicing, making this fade, this transition really smooth from the mustard to the bright yellow. And so then this is a typical way for it to hang in the booth.
In the booth.
And so here, we sometimes paint on the fixtures.
Okay.
Like the way that these are. And this is actually a new fixture that one of the fabricators made that's adjustable. So because paint is bound by gravity. So, when you want to get the really fine application of the paint than to have it in a position where the paint can land is really optimal. And getting the matte finish, which I think is really important in the painted works for creating this illusion that they're sort of like pure color, that is kind of magic. These complex forms, it has a way of bouncing around. And so to get it really smooth and not double is just like
and so
skillful.
It's urethane paint that you're using, right?
Yeah, it's a 3-part paint.
And how long does it generally take in this part of the process? How long does it take for it to cure or settle?
The whole process is really, it takes several days,
Okay.
sometimes weeks, because Jeff will paint them and then first you have to prime them and then we bring them out and then we kind of see a different set of flaws and then they go back into body working and then they go back in and then they get painted.
They kind of go back and forth, so it's not like body working is complete,
right?
And then you
painting.
come to painting.
It's not at all, and especially with the high polished discs, those will go back and forth a lot.
The way you go about choosing your colors, is there a specific kind of part of the color chart that you gravitate to, or is it really instinctive how you alight on the colors you want to work with?
It's very intuitive, but so Matthews is the color system I use right now. They have fans, which is like so many colors. And then the colors are always color context.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking about them in context with each other, but also kind of with other colors that we're thinking about culturally. So they have these irrelevance or relevance. There's like a currency of color that's not inherent. And that's part of the context. So it's not just like what's behind it or like what's in the set.
And the surfaces, once they're complete, are fragile, right?
Yes and no. I mean, it's like a car.
Okay.
So if you key a car, it's like it doesn't actually take that much effort to destroy the paint job, But you can scrub it. We had a piece come back that had been really abused, and so we're just like, well, let's just really just like power hose it, scrub it, because we know we have to totally repaint it. And I was so happy to see how much scrubbing you can do, and it's just like
how resilient it is.
It's actually very resilient, as long as you're not using a BB gun, or like a lawnmower.
If you're not like actively going out to kind of like attack them.
Yeah.
But they can live outside quite comfortably as well as they can indoors as well.
Yeah.
So.
Some of the colors though, like the super light pink is just like, oh, it's sensitive. And black too, it's like it kind of relies on its perfection for its magic, so you don't really want to have like bird dropping on it. It's gonna, so it's like their sensitivity is, it's not just that the paint is sensitive, but it's sort of like the context. Each one has a very different personality. Like there's certain types of textures I would never paint certain colors.
Okay.
Like if I had a really rectilinear one, I'm like, oh, green, obviously. It's like Kelly green.
Yeah.
But if it's like all mushy, I'm like, like light pink,
It must be fun kind of like adapting, like pairing them together.
Yeah.
It's almost like finding that kind of perfect, union between the color and the form.
No, absolutely, because it's the color is, it has meaning. I mean, and it's partly cultural, and then it's partly something else. It's partly our just experience with colors in the world.
So maybe we can now talk a little bit about the Met Commission. First question, when we reached out and invited you, what were some of the thoughts you had around the invitation and this idea of occupying or creating a response to these empty niches, these unoccupied pedestals that are framed by this neoclassical facade?
I mean, it's such an amazing opportunity. I'm really so excited. And when I look at architecture, of course, like I look at it very like semiotically.
Yeah.
I mean, I look at it aesthetically, but I'm trying to I'm reading it for what does it mean, And in that building, I read, the 19th century, and then I read like, oh, both the revivals and the survival of classical antiquity, and what is it what is its significance for then an encyclopedic museum that's established in New York in the 19th century, right?
Yeah.
So just that whole, all that content is there, and then all the meaning of like that building is there to begin with. So it's like a very complex frame.
Yeah.
You know? So that's the frame.
Yes.
And then I think that what I aimed to do was something that was both appropriate and, you know, that this is an appropriate gesture. It's not an inappropriate gesture. At the same time, it has to sort of like be a break, because to say something neoclassical in this moment and not rethink it is to sort of like forget that we had modernism. And so modernism is part of this tradition, but it's like ostensibly not. And so I wanted to talk about that too, you know? Yeah. And so then the gesture I felt like had to be impolite, you know, not disrespectful, but impolite at the same time. It was like sort of, and striking that tone, like that was something that guided me, you know, because I don't want something to be like disrespectful, right? But it's funny. And at the same time, it's austere. And I think that something I'm really drawn to is something that's like really austere, but also totally weird, you know?
Yeah.
That's kind of that's my tone.
That's the tone.
Yeah.
And it's, as you're saying, it's like you're participating in this generational conversation as someone who's looking to these spaces and imagining how to kind of present something in them which feels, you know, engaged with what has come prior to it, but then also that's off its moment.
Right.
And I think, as you said, the gesture of it being slightly impolite, that's kind of what has, even as you're saying, it guided you. It's also kind of helped the forms kind of come into themselves, which is that they project out of the niches.
Right.
They're not contained by it, but they kind of push forward in a way.
Yeah, and in that way kind of grab the whole facade as like, this is the frame for these objects. You know, it's like an appropriation too. I mean, it goes both ways. It's like it serves the building. It's also served by the building. And I think that that's an ambivalent position that I really like.
And that's a kind of masterful way of creating a kind of communion between your work and the building itself. And because aesthetically they exist in very different registers.
Right.
But the way you've done that also, and you've done it in very specific ways. So you've also looked at some of the architectural detailing.
Right.
And had that inform components of the sculptures.
Yeah.
Like the discs, right?
Right. The discs are the same size as the portrait medallions and similar to the columns. So that it's, instead of being, I mean, the appropriate, or the, if we were to go back in time and do what the architects imagined, right? You would do something very deferential and small that sits on the pedestal. So to do something that's actually on the scale of the architecture, of the patterning on the facade is really kind of like, it wasn't what they had in mind, you know? But then it's like, at the same time, it's sort of like speaking to it. So it's sort of like, well, we don't do that dance now.
Yeah.
This is the dance we do, but it meshes, you know?
Very much, yeah.
And, but I think also, so I really enjoy seeing this direct comparison of this machine-made, like very like digitally aided perfect circle compared with the portrait roundel or medallion.
Yeah.
That that this contrast is going to speak to, that we have a very different economy and different type of industry, right? This is like very industrial and pre-industrial kind of language, and then this is like this information age, you know, and that these sit next to each other, and we live in both of them. Then also it's like very like the shape is silly, or it has some silliness, even though it has also this austerity and elegance. And I think in order to be really elegant, it does have to have like a ugliness or like a stupidness you know?
Awkwardness to it.
Awkwardness, okay. Have you read In Praise of Shadows?
Yes.
Yeah. There's like, he says, elegance is frigid. And then he goes on later and he's like, but it's also grimy, you know, which I think is so great, you know. But the elegance of the silver, I think, is like very classical and actually really has, captures the feeling of neoclassical architecture.
Yeah. And also, as you were saying, this idea of thinking about scale, and you were talking, and we also kind of reviewed your process where you like working in the void, and so, and one of the star features of, I think, all the studio visits I've made here is the one-to-one
right
of the facade that you had
we have to
made.
look at that.
Yeah, and then also you have 4 little ones as we enter, and then you have a little replica model, which Tennille found from England of the entire facade. So you had all these different versions of the niche with you through the process.
Yeah, it's really, they each do something very different, because when you see the whole building at once, the objects are going to be really small, you know, but then at scale, of course, it's colossal, you know.
And that's what you said even to me in our initial exchanges, that you wanted to you were interested in something a work or series of works whose scale changes as you kind of go closer and more distant from them. And, you know, there's so many different vantage points our audiences and the city of New York is going to have on this, from a car, pedestrians walking by, standing in line, entering, egressing, up close, from the side, sitting on the stairs. They're going to kind of really, they're emplaced in like a whole different set of vantage points of view. And I know that the idea of a wrong view, a thwarted view, or you think so carefully about how your works can be seen, and you kind of sometimes work to create views that are not right. And working within the confine of the bracket is that, in a way.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I also kind of imagine this like, well, there's 2 different sort of like, they're not exactly narratives, but they're 2 narratives, let's call it that I think about. One is like, okay, how did these come to be?
Yeah.
It was someone with such great force, but not a lot of dexterity, just kind of pushed them into the building, you know? So that's how they should feel. That's how the composition should feel. And that was the importance of having a really small version. It's just to be like, that's my image of how they get in there. They're not prissy, you know? It's, they're crude, but really confident. So that's one narrative. And the other narrative is kind of like between the artist and the viewer, is sort of like the viewer comes and they can infer different things about the intention of the artist. And so if you're going from north to south, you can imagine that that's the correct way to go. If you go from south, because that's the way the street goes.
Yeah.
If you go from south to north, you're seeing the back. And then there's this idea of like, I have the wrong perspective, but I can go and find the right perspective. And this idea of kind of, you know, tracking down these clues of like what was the intention of the artist, I think is I don't know, it's part of the viewing process for me that I imagine.
And something which is so public as well. It also makes it generous and open in a way that there's not a prescription in a certain sense of like, this is how you have to. I mean, your work almost militantly kind of resists that kind of prescribed process of appreciation of how to see and how to understand. And, it's going to be very thrilling to see them actually on the facade. So.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I think is going to be amazing is just having them interact with the incidental light.
Yeah.
Because then that's where they really become, like you're saying, it's like receptive and not dogmatic. It's like they're really changing in relation to where where we are in relation to the sun. And it's sort of like, that's an interesting scale jump that I challenge myself to imagine, is like, you're thinking that this is a big scale. Actually, this is nothing, because we're on a little rock, there's a giant sun, but even that is like over here, and the universe is like, you know what I mean? So it's just like, by signaling, or by I mean, it's so cool that the sun comes up 83rd, you know, and hits them, and you have this idea, it's like Neolithic henge, that it then connects to these really deeper types of time, not just like 100 years or ancient Greeks, or that. It's like really Iron Age, and then sort of like pre-human.